I know this is going to sound strange, but there's a scene I want you to imagine. You're a pigeon. I know. Bear with me. You're a pigeon in a laboratory in the 1950s, and you've learned that pressing a lever produces food. For a while, every time you press the lever, you get a pellet. Reliable, predictable. And then the scientist changes something. Now pressing the lever sometimes produces food, sometimes nothing. You have no idea which press will deliver what. And here's what happens. You press the lever more, not less, more. Obsessively, persistently, frantically more. The uncertainty doesn't discourage you, it consumes you. That experiment was run by Skinner, and what he discovered is one of the most consequential findings in the history of behavioral science. He called it you don't have to remember this, the variable ratio reinforcement schedule. And today it's the design principle behind slot machines, social media feeds, dating apps, loot boxes in video games, and dozens of other technologies that billions of people are using every day without their understanding what's happening to their brains. But here's the thing I find most interesting. The principle didn't begin in the laboratory. It began and still operates in every human relationship where one person withholds just enough to make the other lean in. Teasing, in its most fundamental neurological sense, is the oldest variable ratio schedule in existence. And today, Cole and I want to take it apart.
Welcome back to Neuroscience Digest, powered by my BrainWise coach. I am Cole Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And we are so thrilled that you've joined us for another discussion where we digest or dilute down, or whatever the word is you want to use, some of the neuroscience information and research that's currently being done. And Phil helps us understand what it all means and apply it to our own lives. And if you are enjoying this conversation, then please give us a 5-star rating and review wherever it is you get your podcasts. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to all of our social media platforms. You can find us everywhere at My BrainWise Coach. And Phil, the Skinner experiment is the foundation. So let's make sure that we have that precisely right as we start this discussion.
Yes, Skinner, and I'm not a favorite of Skinner, he was working in the 1950s and 60s on what he called schedules of reinforcement, the different patterns by which rewards can be delivered in response to behavior. He identified 4 basic schedules: fixed ratio, you get a reward after every nth response; fixed interval, you get a reward after a fixed period of time; variable interval, you get a reward after a variable period of time; and variable ratio, you get a reward after a variable number of responses, sometimes after 1, sometimes 10, sometimes after 50. You never know which response will be the one. Of the 4 schedules, variable ratio produces by far the highest and most persistent rates of responding. It's the most resistant to extinction. Animals keep pressing the lever long after rewards have stopped entirely. And the explanation is neurological.
It's somewhat the dopamine anticipation circuit, right?
And this is where Schultz's research in the 90s became essential. He was working at Cambridge, was studying dopamine neurons in monkeys. And he made a discovery that transformed our understanding of how the reward system works. The conventional assumption at that time was that dopamine neurons fire when a reward is received. What Schultz found was that they fire in anticipation of a reward, when a signal predicts that a reward is coming. And more striking, once the monkey learns that a signal predicts a reward, the dopamine response shifts from reward itself to the signal. The reward, when it arrives, produces little additional dopamine. The anticipation is where the neurochemical activity is. The wanting is more powerful than the getting.
This is why uncertainty amplifies the response rather than reducing it.
Because uncertainty means the anticipation cannot be resolved. In a predictable reward schedule, the brain learns exactly when the reward is coming. The dopamine fires at the right moment, and the system can relax between events. In a variable ratio schedule, the brain cannot learn when the reward is coming. Every response might be the one. The anticipation state is therefore continuous. The dopamine system stays activated. The wanting never fully resolves into getting and then rest. It just keeps wanting. Schultz showed that the dopamine response to uncertainty rewards is actually larger than the response to certain ones. The brain values the possibility of a reward more than the certainty of the same reward. This is not irrationality, it's a feature of how the reward system evolved. Environments where reward locations were genuinely unpredictable, the system that maintained the highest persistent motivation to keep searching was the system most likely to keep you survived.
Until the environment changes and the system is to some degree exploited.
Until the environment is deliberately engineered to maintain that activation state indefinitely, which is exactly what slot machines, social media feeds, and certain app designs do. And in a different register, what every skilled tease has always intuitively understood about human desire.
Let's trace the path from the laboratory to the technologies people are using today, because the slot machine is the most obvious application. And I want to understand exactly why it works before we get to, maybe the subtler digital versions.
The slot machine is a near perfect physical implementation of Skinner's variable ratio schedule. The pull of the lever or press of the button is the response. The reward is unpredictable in both timing and magnitude. The near miss, where two of the three symbols match, is a particularly important engineering feature. The near miss activates the anticipation circuits almost as strongly as a win, because the brain interprets it as evidence that the reward is close. In fact, neuroimaging studies show that near misses activate the same brain regions as actual wins in people who are susceptible to problem gambling. The brain isn't registering, oh, I lost again. It's registering, I nearly won. Let's keep going. The near miss isn't a consolation. It's an accelerant in the process.
It's quite obvious that the slot machine designers know this.
They've known it for decades, and they've engineered for it deliberately. The frequency of near misses in modern slot machines is not random. It's calibrated. The machine is designed to produce near misses at a frequency that maximizes the continued engagement of the player without producing wins so frequent that the house loses money. It's an optimization problem with the player's neurochemistry as the variable being optimized.
So let's now talk about the phone, because I suspect most listeners do not think of scrolling their social media feed as a version of pulling a slot machine lever.
The former president of Facebook's growth team said in 2017, I think this is one of the most honest things anyone said in Silicon Valley, and I used to live there, that they've ever said publicly, that the short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that they created are destroying how society works. He was describing exactly the variable ratio schedule. When you scroll a social media feed, you don't know which item will be rewarding. A post that makes you laugh, a notification, a like, a comment, a follow, someone you know, an article that confirms something you believe, a video that surprises you. The reward is unpredictable in both timing and magnitude. You don't know which scroll will deliver. So guess what? You keep scrolling. The feed isn't a passive information stream. It's an engineered variable ratio reinforcement system. And the response it's reinforcing is that act of continued engagement. The same as in the slot machine, you keep pulling because you were close.
Let's talk about the pull to refresh gesture on those mobile apps. What does that mean?
Asa
or
Raskin,
do?
who designed the infinite scroll, later said publicly that it was the design he most regretted. Listen to that. The one he most regretted. The infinite scroll removes the natural stopping points, the page breaks, the load times that would otherwise give the prefrontal cortex a moment to ask whether continuing is a good idea. The pull to refresh gesture on apps like Twitter replicates the physical action of pulling a slot machine lever in a casino almost exactly. Raskin estimated that infinite scroll alone costs around 200,000 aggregate hours of human attention per day. He's since become an advocate for humane technology design. The tool he built, once he understood what it was doing neurologically, was something he did not want to have built.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the dating apps, because those might have a different perspective to some degree.
Well, I've never used one, but from what I understand, the swipe mechanism in dating apps is a particularly elegant implementation of this whole process. Each swipe is a response. The reward, hopefully a match, is unpredictable. The near-miss equivalent is the profile that looks very promising, but doesn't produce a match. The anticipation of a potential connection activates the same dopamine circuits as any other variable ratio schedule. And the design of most dating apps optimizes for continued engagement, for swiping, rather than for actual relationship formation, because continued engagement is what generates their revenue. The neurological architecture of desire has been reverse engineered into a product, and the product's commercial interest is not aligned with the user's well-being.
Now let's talk about the human version of this, because I think this is where the conversation becomes even more interesting and maybe more uncomfortable. Teasing, in the relational sense, operates on the same neurological principle.
It does. It operates on that principle, and you're either applying it with or without conscious awareness. The tease, in its most basic relational form, is the person who signals availability and then withdraws it, who gives enough to sustain anticipation and withholds enough to prevent resolution, who makes the other person feel that the reward is close without them allowing to reach it. And the brain of the person being teased responds to this with the same dopamine anticipation activation that Schultz described in his monkeys. The wanting is amplified by uncertainty. The attention is captured and held. The relationship becomes compelling in a way that predictability never achieves.
There is an important distinction, I think, to make here, because teasing is not always manipulative or harmful. There is a form of it that is genuinely playful and mutually enjoyed.
The distinction, and that's good for you to bring that up, the distinction matters enormously, and it's worth being precise about this. At its best, teasing is a form of play, the deliberate creation of a pleasant anticipation state that both parties enjoy and that resolves eventually in a satisfying way. The playful banter between friends, the flirtation that signals genuine interest while maintaining the pleasure of the chase, the skilled storyteller who withholds the resolution just long enough to maximize the listener's engagement. All of these are benign and genuinely positive applications of the same neurological mechanism and principles. The reward system is being engaged in a context of mutual consent and ultimate resolution. The anticipation is pleasant rather than anxious, and the resolution, when it finally comes, is real.
The harmful version is when the resolution never comes.
Or, that's true, and when the tease is used deliberately to exploit the other person's neurology for one's own benefit. The manipulative partner who uses intermittent reinforcement, alternating warmth and coldness, and tension and withdrawal, to keep the other person in a state of continuous anxious anticipation. The employer who keeps hinting at a promotion that never materializes, maintaining the employee's motivation through the perpetual possibility of reward that's never actually delivered. The cult or high control group that uses intermittent approval and withdrawal to create the kind of dependency that's neurologically indistinguishable from addiction. In each case, the mechanism is identical. What differs is whether the person deploying it has the other's well-being in mind or their own continued leverage.
So let's work through the implications of this systematically, starting with the positive, because I think it is worth being balanced.
The variable ratio schedule, honestly deployed, is one of the most powerful tools available for building engagement, sustaining motivation, and making experiences rewarding. The teacher who makes learning genuinely unpredictable, who introduces the unexpected, who withholds the answer long enough for the student's brain to generate its own anticipation, is using this mechanism in the service of genuine learning. The best narrative writers, from Homer onwards, understood that the reader's engagement is sustained by the management of anticipation, not by the delivery of information. The coach who calibrates a challenge to ability, hard enough to generate effort, but not so hard as to produce despair, is operating in that productive zone of the reward system. And in relationships, the maintenance of genuine interest, curiosity, and surprise, it's a legitimate, healthy expression of the same mechanism that Skinner observed in his pigeons. The difference is in authenticity and resolutions.
We've talked about the positive implications. Now, how about the negative ones?
Negative implications are significant and basically getting worse. The first is the tolerance problem. Repeated activation of the dopamine anticipation circuit at the intensities that engineered variable ratio schedules produce leads to a gradual reduction in baseline dopamine sensitivity. The brown okay.
It's good.
The brain downregulates its own reward response to compensate for that artificial stimulation. The result is what researchers are calling a dopamine deficit state, a condition in which ordinary life, conversation,
The second negative implication is the prefrontal cortex bypass problem.
the prefrontal cortex, the brain's deliberative, self-regulating long-term planning system, is specifically designed to evaluate whether continuing a behavior serves our genuine interests. It's the part of the brain that says, you've been on your phone for an hour, nothing's useful for happening, therefore it's not a good use of your time. The variable ratio schedule is specifically resistant to this kind of deliberative override because the dopamine anticipation state it produces competes directly with that prefrontal function. The person who knows intellectually they should stop scrolling and cannot stop scrolling is not failing at willpower. They're experiencing what Skinner's pigeons experienced. Willpower is a losing strategy against a variable ratio schedule because the schedule is optimized to outlast your willpower. The only reliable strategy is a pre-commitment, removing the opportunity before the schedule starts, not attempting to override it once it's begun.
The third is the exploitation of the vulnerable, of course.
Yeah, the variable ratio schedule exploits the reward system without regard for the person whose reward system it's exploiting. In regulated gambling environments, there are, belatedly and somewhat inadequately, some protections. In digital products, the regulation has barely begun. The 2025 research on social media addiction in Generation Z, finding addiction-consistent patterns in a majority of heavy users, with documented links to anxiety, depression, and attentional deficits, that's not a coincidence. It's the predictable consequence of deploying the most powerful behavioral conditioning mechanism known to psychology on a population that hasn't been told what's being done to them. The former Facebook VP, his admission that they had knowingly built dopamine-driven feedback loops that it's destroying how society works is not an isolated confession. It's the exception only by way of its honesty. So there's three. First, recognize the mechanism when you encounter it. Whether it's a slot machine, a social media feed, a dating app, or a person who's alternating warmth and withdrawal, if you find yourself in a state of continuous unresolved anticipation that's driving your compulsive behavior, you're almost certainly in a variable ratio schedule. Naming it doesn't make you immune. Skinner's pigeons didn't stop pressing the lever because someone explained the schedule to them. But naming it gives your prefrontal cortex something to work with.
What's the, second practical implication or things that our BrainWise friends can do?
Pre-commit rather than rely on your own willpower. The technology is specifically designed to outlast your willpower. If you want to use it less, remove the opportunity before the schedule arrives. App blockers, phone-free rooms, the phone left in another room at night, these work because they move the decision to a moment when the dopamine anticipation state isn't running. Willpower deployed inside the schedule is the wrong tool for the job.
And what's the third one?
In your own relationships and professional behavior, examine your use of intermittent reinforcement. Are you withholding approval, recognition, or warmth in ways that create anxious dependency rather than genuine connection? The variable ratio schedule is available to us in our behavior towards other people just as much as it is to the algorithm designers in Silicon Valley. The difference between a tease and a manipulator is often not the mechanism, it's the intention and the resolution. One of them eventually delivers. The other keeps you pressing the lever forever.
I think something that's interesting and probably wasn't thought of by Skinner is that his pigeons would somewhat end up in our pockets.
Yeah, I'm sure he would have found it fascinating and slightly alarming in equal measure. The science is neutral. The application is not.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of Neuroscience Digest. We are so thrilled that you're with us. If you enjoyed today's conversation, rate and review us. Give us a 5-star rating wherever it is you get your podcasts, and like, comment, share, and subscribe on all of our social platforms. You can find us everywhere at My BrainWise Coach. And until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay
BrainWise.